In any event, I will do some questions in a minute, but first I want to talk for a while about the Civil War. That was such a big part of making our country into what it is. And I can't believe that I knew so little about it. And you're saying, but Bill, geez, you always talk about the Civil War. Yeah, but that's the American Civil War. I'm talking about the English Civil War. It was a period in history that was one of a kind of a dark patch for me because I love history. And I love remember very clearly being in school in Bermuda and studying the Middle Ages. It was probably, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade, 5th grade, something like that. So the Middle Ages and the relatively modern history of Britain and the world and, Victoria on forward and so forth and so on. And I knew all that pretty well. And then starting, 9 months ago, 6 months ago, started to get into Shakespeare very much and started getting into the Shakespearean world of Elizabeth and the Armada and a great deal about Shakespeare and remarkable stuff. And just as I was wrapping that up, I realized that from about 1610 to about, really to the 1600s, the bulk of the 1600s, I didn't know much about. I knew, of course, that there was an English Civil War. I knew that Charles I, the Stuart King, Charles I, was executed. I knew from a very long time ago that there were Roundheads and Cavaliers. My high school mascot in Coral Gables was Cavalier, and I thought it was pretty cool. I don't think so much anymore. And I knew that for a period of some time, I don't know, it was 6 years, 11 years, something like that, I knew that England was without a king and that Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. And that's about all I knew. I'd heard that Cromwell was a usurper and a brute and exceedingly cruel, and just a man who basically decided to chop off the king's head so he could become king himself and so on. And it was just a surface gloss of that period, and I just knew it was there, but I didn't know anything about it. Well, hi-de-ho. Sometimes, I say things and it lights people up because they happen to know some things about this, but I've read books that were extremely critical of Cromwell, and I've read a number of books recently that were supportive of Oliver Cromwell. And just based on his actions and his words in his own speeches, I have come to believe he's one of the most underrated figures in history and a significant part of our national heritage here in the United States, a significant part of it. So let me just kind of tell you some of the things I've learned about the English Civil War, and we'll do a couple questions. Okay, so the Tudor dynasty, Henry VIII comes in, and Britain is Catholic like everybody else, but the Reformation has already started, and Luther and the Protestantism in Europe and so on. Henry VIII wants a divorce. Pope doesn't give him one, so Henry VIII basically tells the Pope to pound sand, and in what is probably the most egotistical move in the history of the world, I'm ready to stand by that, Henry VIII decided to make his country Protestant and take it away from the Catholic faith because he wanted to get, wanted to climb in the sack with his new girlfriend. So it's good to be the king. So England becomes Protestant. Church of England is Anglican religion is a subset of Protestantism. Henry VIII dies. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, takes over. She's called Bloody Mary because she's trying to get the country back to Catholicism and burns an awful lot of people at the stake doing it. So she finally goes. And then Elizabeth I comes to power. Now, I think Elizabeth is extremely overrated. I think, on balance, having read a lot of history of that period now, she strikes most people, and certainly historically, she comes across as exceedingly vain, exceedingly indecisive, never paid her soldiers or the sailors that saved her crown, while Philip, on the other hand, of Spain, who launched this armada, was basically there at the dock handing out money and bandages when he came back. So Philip II in defeat in Spain was a far better person than Elizabeth I was in victory in England. So Elizabeth rules for quite a long time, 25, 30 or something like that. And the famous Virgin Queen doesn't have any kids. So that's a problem when you have a hereditary monarchy. So they're trying to figure out who's going to be king, and there's only one contender who seems to have it wrapped up, and that's James VI of Scotland, James Stuart. Yeah, just this split second just now realized that. I just this first time ever realized James Stuart. That's Jimmy Stewart. So James VI of Scotland is invited to come down to England and become their king, so he goes and he becomes King James I, first of the Stuart dynasty. And is not a terribly effective ruler, but relatively strong, so he keeps things more or less under control and walks a pretty fine line, keeping England Protestant after Bloody Mary tried to take it back to Catholicism, and at the same time not suppressing the Catholics too hard. James dies, and he's succeeded by his son Charles I, who fervently believed that, and it's a convenient thing to believe if it's good to be the king. Charles I fervently believed that he was that God made him king. Everybody believed in God, and that his works were right in front of your eyes all the time. And Charles I believed in this idea of the divine right of kings. He thought that he was put on the throne by God, and any attempt to get him off the throne was a subversion of God's will. That's about the best thing you can say about Charles I. He was a very duplicitous guy, constantly making deals with people and selling out allies and all the rest, and living a kind of lifestyle that made people a little resentful. But here's where the story just gets so interesting to me in terms of the history of America, because I just never heard any of these. But to be honest with you, the American, not just the American Revolution, the entire American experience is predicated on the English Civil War. And another thing that I found amazing in retrospect is everybody knows the Puritans, right? Okay, so we know that the Puritans came to America, that America was settled by the Puritans, or North America was anyway, and the Puritans land on Plymouth Rock, and we know they have those funny hats and the white long collars, and we see cartoons of them at Thanksgiving, and that's what we know. We know the Puritans. And why were the Puritans here? The Puritans were escaping religious prosecution in England, drummed into our head from the beginning, back when they used to teach history here in this country. So that's all I knew about the Protestants, about the Puritans, and I just knew they were deeply religious people, and I didn't know anything else about it, and I really didn't dawn on me to check into it. But the Puritan movement started in England, I guess, probably during the reign of James, and by the time Charles comes along, a significant portion of the Parliament and a significant portion of the population is Puritan. And the Puritans believed that God could speak to anybody. God could just speak to you, that you didn't need to go through the Roman Church, and you didn't need to go through the Protestant Church either. The Puritans were exceedingly religious, but again, lost on me was how fundamentally moral they were and how committed they were to liberty, to the idea of liberty. So Cromwell, who's been basically slandered and libeled for 300-400 years now. If you look at the history of Cromwell, the English Civil War is actually 3 civil wars. Charles decides he wants to appoint some bishops. Parliament says no. Charles says, all right. He leaves London, raises an army, is in very strong shape, looks like he's going to win. And then this regular guy, kind of a burgermeister, not much more than that, at 43 or something, not a terribly attractive man, was a member of Parliament, and he takes the field as the cavalry officer, second in command, General of Horse, I think they called him, in this war against King Charles. And Oliver Cromwell had recruited, I'm compressing time a little bit, after the first battles, it didn't go very well, and Cromwell decided he was going to do something different, so he basically started something called the New Model Army, and it was the first idea of a standing army, but Cromwell's specific people, because there were lots of little militias and so on that were coming from different people under different people's command, but Cromwell's men got nicknamed Ironsides after Cromwell, who was nicknamed Ironside. And the reason they got nicknamed that was because these men were so passionately believing in God and that they were doing Christ's work that they were tremendously effective in battle. He basically went out and raised a citizen army. He said, I would rather have something like, I would rather have a man with a dirty cloak and knew what he believed than one of your gentlemen who's had all this training and all this money. So he's a real, not a populist in the bad sense of the word. He's a guy who believes in the common people. And the thing that struck me so much was all throughout this first battle, the first wars of the Civil War, many battles, Cromwell just keeps showing up and is snatching victory out of the jaws of defeat. He's an astonishing commander, astonishing. And he never once ever stops saying, all the time, it's just continuous, God did this, this is God's work, not me, blah, blah, blah. He's just constantly saying, it's not me, it's not me, it's not me, it's God. It should be obvious to everybody. And his troops felt that way too. So they turned the tide on the British, on the English royalists, the Cavaliers. And finally Charles is captured. Now, during this whole time, Cromwell's detractors say he was just vying to be the king. But if you look at his actual record and if you look at the things he said, he was doing pretty much everything possible not to be king. He wanted a restoration of the monarchy. He wanted Charles I back on the throne. He didn't think he was a good guy, but he believed like everybody else in this idea of kings. He just thought that the people and Parliament should come first. So Charles is locked up, and now all of a sudden, you've got this interregnum of 5-6 years. The first Civil War, which they think is the Civil War, is over. And Charles is trying to make all these deals to be reinstated on the throne. And what Parliament wants is Parliament wants Charles to recognize that Parliament outranks the king. Hey, Chuck, we love you. Think you're cool. Love the hat and the long hair, by the way. And we dig the whole king thing. But we're writing your paycheck and not the other way around, right? Solid? And Charles says no. Nope, I'd rather die. And so he did. Into this mix now comes the army, and the army is the English army is pulling very hard for things like back pay and so on, which is a universal story throughout history. But they're also much more radical in the kind of the sense of the word when it was a good sense. The army's largely pulling for a republic. So you've got this kind of deceitful king who believes that God had put him there to rule England. You've got Parliament, which is correctly saying the will of the people should come first, and we represent the will of the people, but the so-called Long Parliament was in session for 11 years without an election, and some guy named Pride comes in there, and somewhere in the middle of this 11-year period of Parliament, this army officer walks in, probably without Cromwell's approval, but certainly Cromwell did nothing to undo it, and said, these guys here, this 130 guys here, they're unreliable, get them out. So now there's this rump parliament of people that are kind of on board with the whole thing. So Cromwell's trying to manage this three-way power shift between the king, the parliament, and the army. And he is basically, he just sounds like he's basically trying to kiss the feet of everybody and try to get this arrangement together. But here's the thing about Cromwell that's really, really interesting to me. Cromwell was committed to the idea of religious independence. I don't think at the time he would have gone far enough to say that he didn't care if you were an atheist, but he basically believed that God is speaking to everybody in his own fashion and that nobody had any right to tell anybody else what to think about this, and that this entire Civil War was about religious liberty and democratic freedoms as guaranteed by representation of the people. And I had no idea. I have come to the conclusion, I don't want to go too far out on this, Earl of Oxford, Israeli Shakespeare limb, but having read a fair amount on both sides of the issue, I'm really coming to believe that we really need some statues of Oliver Cromwell, because he was fighting for ideas that were about 150 years ahead of his time, maybe 100 years ahead of his time. They were trying a century earlier than when it caught fire in the 1700s. they were trying to set up a democratic republic with a king essentially as a figurehead, and that this was God's will. And Cromwell seemed to have fought for that his whole life. I've read his speeches and I've seen some of the actions that he took. He strikes me as a guy who was doing everything he could to not take power. I know when he did become Lord Protector, a lot of the people who were originally against the king said, no, now we have a new king who's not even really a king. If we're going to have a guy in charge of us with autocratic powers, which Cromwell did have, then let's get the king back, for God's sakes. They saw it as a big sellout. Cromwell apparently was looking around for somebody to do this, and Parliament, which won the Civil War, the first one, is now corrupt and trading money for power. Imagine my shock and surprise when I read that. That their Congress was corrupt. It nearly knocked me out of my chair. And so he's basically saying, all right, somebody's got to hold this country together. And then, astonishingly, in the middle of all of this turmoil, for the first time ever, really, England gets some street cred. The Navy under Admiral Blake and a couple of others in parliamentary Navy of the Commonwealth just start kicking ass, just sweeping the French and the Spanish off the seas, and the Dutch. They're at war with the Dutch. And the army, the new model army, is so powerful because of the fervent motivation. That one, actually, I should write that down. Motivation of the troops is a virtually unstoppable force. And all of a sudden, Little England is having its toes kissed by France and Spain and the Dutch and all the rest of it. And that's basically what he did until he died. There are a couple things about Cromwell that seem to me to be these small touches, but they seem to be indicative of the guy. Obviously, before photographs, everybody had their portrait painted, and we can be told, I think we can have some confidence in the fact that a painter who wanted to sell the painting and do more paintings for the powerful and the rich would shade those interpretations and make them a little bit prettier than they actually were. But when it came time for Cromwell's portrait, he said to the painter, he said, I want you to paint me as I am. So the most famous picture of him shows a rather large nose, and there's this enormous wart right here on his head. It's not a noble face in terms of the idea of aristocracy, but when they won one of these major battles, Parliament decided to strike a medal in their honor, and Cromwell said, great, the men deserve it, but for God's sakes, literally for God's sake, do not put my image on that medal. First of all, they didn't do it. God did it. Secondly, we are completely opposed to all idolatry and graven images and all the rest of it. So he was not a great orator, and he's certainly not a great writer. His stuff is very hard to read. It's nothing like Lincoln's, whose prose is just brilliant. But I was about to say, I wonder why he's been so buried or abused. I did see the movie Cromwell, by the way, Joe Talbot. Saw bits of it anyway, with Richard Harris, young Richard Harris as Cromwell. He had a couple of others. And Alec Guinness was Charles I in that, and is very, very good. But now, the rest of the story. So Cromwell dies. The Lord Protectorship goes to his son, which is a hereditary monarchy. That's what Parliament wanted. His son's nothing like the man that Oliver was, can't hold it together. And Charles's son, King Charles II, who's been out on the mainland the whole time, in France and trying to raise an army. So the second and third English civil wars, by the way, is Charles II. After they chop off the head of his dad, he's in Ireland trying to form a rebellion, and Charles II wants to come to England with an Irish army behind him to put himself back on the throne. And this is anathema to the English. And then both Charleses were trying to brought armies from Scotland into England to put the Stuarts back on the throne, Charles I and II. So anyway, the whole thing just kind of falls apart, and in a relatively bloodless sort of thing, Charles II is crowned King of England, so the Stuart dynasty is restored. Charles then has a son, King James II. James II is such a catastrophe that there's something else I'd never heard of before, called what the English called the Glorious Revolution. The what now? Yeah, the Glorious Revolution. So the Restoration is the name given to the monarchy coming back with Charles II. Charles II dies, comes James II, and during the reign of James II, people are so unhappy with this king and the Stuarts in general, who are getting worse and worse and worse all the time with every generation. They're just getting more and more depraved. The English decide that this guy, James II, no, we got to do something. And they didn't want to go through all this turmoil of the Civil War again. So they had a British woman in the line, you know, and so she might have been a Stuart. I don't know if she was, but it was Mary, one of 750,000 Queen Marys in English history. So they look over the channel. They'd just been fighting a war with Holland for quite a long time, but they look over to Holland. Cromwell's basically formed a peace treaty and put the Dutch back on their heels. Excuse me. And they decide that that William, I guess it's William of Orange, I'm not 100% sure of that, but it sounds right, that William, King of Holland, is going to come over and he's going to be King of England as well, and he's going to marry this woman Mary, and they would be co-rulers. So we're going to invite kind of a foreign king into England, but we will let them both rule. That's how we can kind of, you know, feel like it. So next thing you know, you've got William and Mary, which is where the College of William and Mary comes from. Oh, you're right. Yes, it wasn't his son. Thank you very much, Edward Smith, supervillain extraordinaire. James II was Charles II's brother. That's right. Thank you. I always like to be corrected on things like that. So basically, this glorious revolution, William, King of Holland, gets on a flotilla, like a little mini armada, and they sail up across the Channel and up the Thames, and they rule together, and off you go. And so that's what led to the dynasty that eventually then became, George I, George II, George III of infamy. And then we had Georges all the way up, and George IV, Queen Victoria, Edward II, Edward Edward the VIII or VI, something. And then George V for the First World War, and then the younger brother becomes George VI during World War II. Father of Queen Elizabeth, who's the longest reigning monarch in the history of the world. There's never been a king or queen that has reigned longer than Queen Elizabeth II. So anyway, that's the history. But what I had not understood was this whole idea of the Puritans and what they brought to this country. Like I said, all I've ever been taught about them was that they were escaping religious persecution in England. Okay. What's especially interesting is there was a period when Charles abolished the Parliament, and there was something like 10 or 11 years where there was no Parliament, 12 years, something like that. And Cromwell was so sick of it that he said, I'm going to America. He was pretty much packed and ready to come to New England and become an absolutely, utterly obscure, unknown person in the colonies, when at the last minute he rallied, went back, and then the Civil War started. But I think the man deserves a lot more recognition than he gets, because he was the representative of a movement that believed in, not just in direct communication with God, but also believed largely in religious tolerance and liberty, and certainly was fighting for the people's right to be ascendant over some lunatic. George III, George IV. I love my audience. George, yes. So William and Mary, that was William III. So George III, George IV, William IV, Victoria. Now I get some more familiar around. Victoria's son, Edward VII, then George V during World War I. Edward VIII, who was the one who abdicated for the divorcee. George VI, who became king during World War II, who gained, if you've seen the King's Speech, that's the younger brother of Edward. Edward abdicates, and the younger brother takes the name of George VI. And George VI is the father, as Dave Big Booty says, Edward VIII, George VI, and Lizzie the Deuce. So if I read that correctly, if Elizabeth dies and the current English throne passes to Charles, I think he would be Charles III. I think so. Whoa, screen just went out because I haven't touched anything. And if William becomes king, he would be William V. William is an awesome name, by the way. For those of you who don't know, the name William means indomitable helmet of conquest. And Whittle means White Hill region of Lancashire, and a little town called Wigan, which also features prominently during the Civil War. And that will do it for this little history lesson. But it bears serious study, because I was really, really shocked to see all of American history and all of the ideas of the American Revolution being fought for during the English Civil Wars 150 years earlier. And Edward Smith, supervillain extraordinaire, who corrected me a moment ago, said Edward VIII wound up being exiled to Bermuda, where I live, Bill. Actually, he was exiled to the Bahamas. So the sword of correction cuts both ways, my friend, unless there's something else that I'm unaware of, which is usually the case. He was, Edward, just another cool piece of history. So you got George V. He's the king during World War I. His eldest son, Edward, is a playboy, and, he completely infatuated with this woman. Gives up being king. And then, even though he was King Edward VIII, during the war, you've got the second brother, who's now King George VI, World War II. He's the figurehead. Winston Churchill is the whole government, really. But you've still got King George VI, who appointed Churchill against his better judgment at first. And you've got a guy who's king, but on the same playing field is his older brother, who was also king. He's now ex-king. And the ex-king and his wife, Wallace something or other, are big Nazi fans. They think Hitler's awesome. They're making all kinds of sympathetic noises about Hitler. They went to Germany in the 30s and talked about how wonderful it was, and Churchill basically said, Churchill and the king said, it's not really good optics for the British Empire, which is the only combatant that fought the entire war, front to end. The only one of the five major powers, Japan, Germany, Russia, America, and England, they're the only ones that fought the whole war. Germans didn't finish it. The Japanese didn't start it. The Americans came in afterwards, and so did the Russians. But the British fought, Wallace Simpson. The British fought the whole thing. And so they said, well, we've got this guy here who's former King of England saying that Hitler's cool. So Churchill, in cooperation with Parliament and King George, the younger brothers, say, Edward, we're going to make you ambassador to Nassau, Bahamas. Have a nice trip. Oh, and by the way, you're forbidden to visit America while you're 30 miles off the coast, or whatever it is, from Miami to Nassau. It's 40-something. I've flown it in a Cessna 172. It's not a big, long distance. So he was not allowed to even visit America because he was so destructive. He's not a good guy at all. But Oliver Cromwell stands there, in my mind, as a certainly remarkable figure. I know he's very seriously criticized, mostly for his actions in Ireland, where he allowed a massacre of a couple of towns to happen. But as the person writing the book says, there's no real excuse for that, except, and this book that I'm reading was written in 1890, which is great to read something from that time. Just the standards and so on have fallen. But it was pointed out that when Cromwell was completely unknown, the Irish had risen up against the English and had massacred 2,000 or 3,000 Protestants in a particularly bloody fashion. So when Cromwell goes to Ireland after he wins the English Civil War, he goes to Ireland, defeats the Irish, and a couple of towns refuse to surrender, and the rules of the day were pretty simple, really. If we are going to besiege your city, we will surround your city, invest it, we would say. And once we've surrounded your city, we will send you an official request for your surrender. If you surrender, then we will let you live and we'll be relatively, nice to you. But if you fight and you make us take the city, if we have to fight for the city, once we start fighting for it, then you're all going to die. Some variations on that where once the first hole was punched in the wall, if they kept going after that, then no one. But basically, Cromwell was basically saying, look, these are the people that murdered, 2,000-3,000 Protestants, and of course the English had murdered a bunch of Irish too. But nothing he did was outside the boundaries of what was known to be the rules at the time. And furthermore, after this particularly brutal, basically execution of these two towns after they fell after refusing to surrender, the Irish rebellion essentially fell apart. And then he went to Scotland, did the same thing. Not so much with a rebellion, but he was just victorious wherever he went. Made England into a great power. And so why is Cromwell so badly maligned, and if not maligned, then forgotten? Well, you have kings going back to the Dark Ages, going back into prehistory. You got the Norman conquest in 1066 with William the Conqueror. And then you have a break, and then the king comes back. And history is written by the victors. So the aristocracy that returned to England, needless to say, did not put a very good light on Cromwell. And it was a biographer named Carlyle who took the trouble in the time in this, I want to say mid-1700s, late 1700s, to go back and read all of Cromwell's letters and wrote the first real kind of a biography, I think, in history, and resurrected his reputation. Cromwell said repeatedly that he didn't care about all of the opprobrium and all the rest of the stuff. He knew that he would be recognized in God's time, and he felt confident that he was doing the Lord's work on earth, so he just didn't care what people thought about him. I find admirable. I wish I had more of it. But the final little bizarre coda to all of this is, so Cromwell dies a natural death. He's buried with honors, obviously. His son becomes Lord Protector. He drops the ball. The king comes back. Now the royalists are in power again after this interregnum, this break between lines of kings and queens going back all the way. And so what they do, once King Charles is back and they've completely taken over power, is in order to teach him a lesson, Cromwell, who's been dead 5-6 years, 3, 4, 5 years, something like that at this time, they dig him up out of the ground, break him out of his vault. They take the 5 or 6 year old corpse and hang it by the neck, which I can't even imagine how that actually holds up, but that's what they did. They pulled Cromwell's body out of, it's Bermuda for me, Edward. They pulled Cromwell's body out of his vault, take his corpse, hang it, and then draw and quarter it. They cut his head off and, scatter his bones, except for the head. And there is some fairly decent provenance for the head. Oliver Cromwell's head is still around in mummified form, or at least it was until the 20th century. It may have been lost recently, but I don't think so. Somebody's holding up this mummified head of Oliver Cromwell, and it looks like it was actually him. He deserved better than that, I think. If he had succeeded, maybe if he'd lived longer, because he basically was the only thing that held this whole thing together time and time again. It was his moral certainty he would come into Parliament and say, "You're all a bunch of whoremongers and speculators. I hereby dissolve this Parliament." So he was a real autocrat, and there's no getting away from that. It was dictatorial autocrat, but every decision he made, looking at it from I think a fair perspective, was autocratically deciding things in order for the people's will to be expressed. So this is my history, my personal family history. Half of it, my dad. So I have 4 grandparents, obviously. Or do I? Maybe I don't have any grandparents at all. Maybe I was spawned out of a oyster shell. That's a possibility. It's certainly my pet theory, but I don't have any evidence that that's true. I have 4 grandparents. My father's father is English. My father's mother is Polish. My mother's father is English, and my mother's mother is Portuguese. So I'm half English, quarter Portuguese, and quarter Polish. German Polish, right in that neighborhood, which is such a peaceful and calm place throughout history. And most of the fighting, a lot of the fighting happened up in the northwest of England in Lancashire, near the little town of Wigan, where our family tree was traced back by my cousin Jack. I think got us back to 1725, and we are, this may be a bingo word, we are cotton carters and coal miners. Victoria says, I think this is a quote from him, "I've learned that if you fear God, you have no one else to fear." Pretty much true. So I was pleased to have learned something about him, and I'm also pleased to be able to share it with whatever people are watching here. So I think he deserves, at the very least, I think he deserves a fresh look. Okay. Yes, and he said I should do 23andMe. I've got, speaking of unboxing things, I've got 2 of them over there, and it's been there for a year, and I haven't done it yet. Yeah, I have no doubt that if you were to break down, and it's just the fact that you can do that, just the fact that you can use DNA to tell you, where you came from, what lines you came from, is just tremendous. I wouldn't be the slightest bit surprised to find that, there's all kinds of African blood and Asian blood and all kinds of other things everywhere. I would not be at the least bit surprised, nor would I be the least bit upset about it. I would be, whatever it showed, it would have my interest, because they were tough people and smart people. Eric Blake says he recently learns that he is the direct descendant of the secret keeper of Henry VI. Okay, well, congratulations. Just somehow King Eric doesn't really quite have the right ring to it, does it? King Eric the First. Anyway, congratulations, Eric. All right, so we'll do a couple questions just for the sake of it, and then we will call it a night. And then I'll text my beautiful, lovely wife and see if I can get permission to stay for a little while longer and plug in this awesome thing, see if I get it going. Here we go.